You guys all said it couldn't be done. You all said it was impossible. Well, here we are. This is it. We've arrived. Anyway, that whole kind of thing aside, we're back with, of course, another episode of Meta Mondays. This one's quite a doozy. We've got several new decks. As you can see, this is getting long. This is actually like, this is a bit of a problem. Like, we made the site, and it just has too many decks now. You know, when I planned the format of this website, I didn't anticipate a meta with so much like diversity of play. And we're seeing like consolidations in terms of like tier 1 and tier 2 decks, like starting to really distinguish themselves. Play rates are starting to, equalize, but it's still just like, there's so many different ways to play the game right now, and I might need to literally reformat the way this is visually displayed, because it looks kind of like ass, because it's just like a literal like 2-scroll list of just like decks. So as always, we're going to be using stat-driven analysis of, decks, and we're going to be talking about deck types. I've updated, I think, almost every single one of these decks for this week, like I pretty much always do. There are probably like 2 or 3 items on this list that didn't get updated. I looked at them and decided there's no need to change a card compared to last week. They feel good as they are. But most things we did update, in some cases, significantly. We're going to go ahead and break that all down. I'm going to link in the pinned comment, as always, to, the reference to the stats on Mobalytics. And I'll be referring to those throughout this entire video. I'm going to also make it a point to kind of like talk more about the decks and how they play, just for people that kind of like aren't necessarily, aware of how every single deck plays, which is something that I should have been doing this entire time, but I'll kind of be breaking down like, who the deck might be for. And if you want an updated version, you can also visit the site here, because I'm going to be pretty constantly updating these decks, some more than others, of course, depending on kind of like what I'm playing and what's seeing like play in the meta at the time. Or you can, of course, stop by on my Twitch stream at twitch.tv/swimstream. Anyway, before we get into the individual deck segment, where I will be going deck by deck, talking about individual card choices, card changes, why the deck is good, and of course talking about play rates and win rates, we're gonna just do a real quick brief like meta overview. So Kinkou Elusives is back with a vengeance, coming out at a really staggering win rate. They have established themselves as a tier 1 deck in an environment where burn is less prevalent. They're sort of like an alts deck to burn that other people will have to deal with. The reason Kinkou Elusives disappeared there for a bit was most notably just because it was a worse version of burn aggro at the time. Now that burn's received, 2 significant nerfs, suddenly they're pretty even. Kinkou Elusives might even be pulling a little bit ahead. Then we've got the Shadow Isles aggro. We see that in tempo versions of Endure, or my Nox Shadow Isles aggro version. I've seen people experimenting with Shadow Isles Ionia as well. A lot of like Cursed Keeper, Blighted Caretaker, Ravenous Butcher, that kind of thing. So you'll see a lot of experimentation there. Many people playing that kind of archetype. It's still a little too soon to say whether it's maybe like a flavor of the week or whether this has real staying power, but that's been a big change since last week as well. And finally, we're seeing, Vlad Sejuani rear its ugly head. Okay, fine. I'll talk. Listen. I'll talk about this one later, okay? When we get there. And a couple of notes as well. Some things have been bumped down to tier 3. Karina Control, and I know, Karma Ezreal. I think that their future versions of Karma Ezreal will have to see some bumps up. The win rates have just been coming back like really weak on Karma Ezreal. She's definitely a better tournament deck than a ladder deck, though. Like, she's not necessarily bad in every environment. We've been seeing Lux Heimerdinger actually stabilize as a pretty powerful deck, basically kind of like securing what I predicted would happen last week, which is just like a sizable play rate, a pretty decent like tier 2 win rate. That's what came in at like tier 3 stats last week, but it felt like a solid deck, and it's proving that, which is, great. There's a lot of different ways to build it, as well as we'll be getting into. And of course, Yoink Sejuani proving to be very good. I think that it's more popular to go into like Yoink version versions than the old kind of like tempo versions. Yoink being the package of Black Market Merchant and Pilfered Goods, which have been cut largely from the deck in general. But that's kind of like the overall rundown of how things have changed last week to this week. As always, well, I say as always, last week was kind of irregular just because the win rates were skewed. Again, these are generalizations, there's going to be exceptions, but tier 1 is often going to be high win rates, and there are a lot of 60+% win rates this week with some kind of like the powerhouse decks that you'll see here. Alright, so right off the bat we have Yoink Sejuani. Now this deck has gone through a few transformations. Right off the bat when people were playing it like early in the patch, as soon as kind of like the nerfs came through, the Yoink version was kind of the most prevalent. That was with like Black Market Merchant and Pilfered Goods. For about a week there, it became kind of more popular, and for a short time, a higher win rate to be playing the Tempo version. Tempo Sejuani being, you could almost argue a different archetype. It's a really big change to how the deck plays, just kind of like going very aggressive, whereas playing a lot of like the slow and conditional draw cards. But this list plays slower, and right now that's kind of exactly what you want to be doing, right? We had a big shift in terms of the last meta, which is, okay, so we had a very controlled, very control and super fast aggro polarizing meta, right? With like super slow decks or burn was kind of like how it was shaping up. Now that both sides of the spectrum have been nerfed down, we're seeing kind of like a weird rebound effect. And yeah, basically just because so many people were still using or trying variations of a lot of the old, like, kind of like super slow control-y kind of deck styles, well, suddenly, for a while, it was very, very powerful to speed your strategy up, right? Again, I always say that you want to be a lot faster than your opponent or a little slower in terms of kind of when you're coming online. And, of course, when everyone is kind of speeding up and playing for tempo, then you sort of get a second wave where you want to slow down a little bit. That's kind of what we're seeing here. This deck, for example, is able to beat mirrors, as a big example of that, but also other sort of like tempo driven decks, just by taking, a concept that plays for the board very early, but just making sure it's got good value, doesn't run out of resources or anything like that either. Now, speaking of all that kind of stuff, I actually recently added, this is like under the kind of like deck list, a little sort of like key to explain like various terminology and how like certain things get countered by other things that some people might find helpful, because a lot of these terms I think are honestly, people define them in subtly but importantly different ways. Like, even like card game veterans will use these terms in ways that are mostly the same but sometimes different. So this is kind of like how I would break everything down personally. Anyway, that aside, let's talk about the actual Yoink Sejuani deck. I have this like really bad habit of getting derailed. Okay, so Yoink Sejuani, this is like current version, and basically, again, now that things are slowing down again, we're back to the Yoink plan. This has been kind of like the highest win rate version of Sejuani coming in for the last week. Basically, you apply a lot of pressure, you do have a bit of a flexible game plan, but for the most part, you're also okay taking games late, because if they don't kill you by the time Sejuani or Riptide Rex are coming down to potentially end the game, they will lose. And that's kind of the key with this deck. It applies pressure in both directions, and it's really hard to be killing them faster than something like Sejuani will come online. Alright, next up we've got Heimervi. Heimervi coming in this week at roughly a 57% win rate, which is pretty good. It's one of the most popular decks on ladder, and for good reason. It's fairly strong. I do think this deck was kind of like overrated a little bit early on. It was kind of like one of the decks that power spiked early on because it got like less nerfed than other decks. But because of that, and this is, by the way, one of the reasons, because this deck was so popular early on, what I was just talking about, the super, like, tempo stuff, that was partially to counter this deck. It was super powerful, super popular the first like week or two after, the nerf came through, and what that means is, yeah, you see people cutting Yoink out. This deck has declined since then. It's definitely seeing like less super crazy play. Overall, still a pretty powerful deck though. Basically the playstyle is you just kind of want to stall out. You don't play much defense early, so you are vulnerable to getting rushed out, and by the way, that's another reason people are running like the Shadow Isles stuff. More on that later. But right now, you are basically just going to pass the first several turns. You're going to be playing, your spells to keep yourself alive. Just like, a unit to block on turn 3, and then eventually you'll play one of your champions, usually Heimerdinger, and if they can't kill it within 2 turns, they've effectively lost the game, because you'll swarm the board with a bunch of elusive units that will literally just end the game kind of on the spot. You actually end games fairly quickly here. This is one of the decks that, because its timing to end games is so fast when you have like several turns of, not even many turns, but like 1 or 2 turns of just summoning free turrets is just already enough to end the game. And that is the kind of deck that can actually kill something like Sejuani like before she's coming online. All right, next up we've got Kinkou Elusives. Sorry, there's not actually much to talk about this Heimer vibe because it hasn't really gone through any changes. Okay, Kinkou Elusives. This is a deck that has been kind of in hibernation for a little while. Now, Kinkou Elusives is going to come in this week at a 60% win rate. Pretty massive. We'll see if it's able to maintain that. Basically, the premise of this deck is very simple. You're going to flood the board with a lot of cheap units. It is, I would characterize this deck as an aggro deck, although it does play fairly slowly. This is sort of like, again, a weird paradox because people are defining these concepts in slightly different ways. Some people might consider the fact that it plays like not super fast to disqualify it from the concept of being aggro. But I would consider this to be an aggro deck. It doesn't do any of the normal like mid-range tendencies, very much so, and you are going to be basically bursting your opponent down without them having any interaction outside of that, right? It's very similar to the old burn list, but instead of using spells, you're using unblockable elusive units, plus, you know, the idea of buffs with stuff like Omen Hawk, as well as, you know, maybe Fury of the North in this case. Fury of the North is recently been added to this deck by Menuus, and I've been liking this version personally with 1 Elixir of Iron and 3 Fury of the North, which has been performing very well for me. Overall, this is a very easy and cheap deck. You'll notice it only runs 1 champion, which is also a starter champion, and, you know, 1 epic that you'll have to craft a couple of times, but it's a great deck for new players. Tempo Endure. So now Tempo Endure is a really interesting archetype. This is something that I've been fiddling around with quite a lot for the last several days. You might have seen like the Nox SI deck. We put a video guide up about that one. This one's very similar. In fact, I've kind of like, I was playing Endure and then I branched into like a much more aggressive tempo version, and then I branched into the Nox version of Shadow Isles and cut out the Endure completely. My next step might be, who even knows, going into Ionia, because I do want to mess around more with aggro Shadow Isles concepts. Overall, Endure is showing like a shockingly high play rate. Between like different variations of speed, Endure is hovering anywhere between like a 58 and 60% win rate. Super massive, although again, that's not all the same kind of list. This is a very aggressive version of Endure. Here we're running Ravenous Butcher, Bark Beast, Cursed Keeper, as well as Blighted Caretaker, and the idea of this deck is to basically just make sure you are killing your opponent very quickly. We're going to be sacrificing Keeper with like Caretaker and Butcher, triggering kill synergy things like Collector, and eventually the They Who Endure, which can finish the game later with Atrocity. Overall, this is definitely one of the better decks that Shadow Isles archetype can play for. Right now, the jury is not out on whether this is like better than the Noxus version. I should show you that right now just because it's kind of relevant to the point I'm making right now, but this is the Noxus version that I've been playing. It's a very aggressive deck. We're combining like aggro Shadow Isles with some of the burn from Noxus. I know it uses the colors of a Spiders deck, but this is not a Spiders deck. It actually plays very differently. Overall, I would say the biggest thing that Tempo Endure has over Nox, kind of like Shadow Isles aggro, is flexibility, which is to say that depending on where the meta is, this deck can speed up or slow down. Remember, we were just saying how important it was that Sejuani Misfortune was able to, you know, exist as a value deck and then speed up when the meta needed it to, and then slow down again when the meta needed it to. That's something this deck you're looking at can do easily. The Noxus version, not so much. It's completely locked in. So if I had to put my money on something, I would say Tempo Endure is kind of like a little more like overall staying power, and that's why I do have it like a little ahead of the Nox version down here. And again, if we, look at the reference chart, tempo, all tempo means is just like pressure, right? It's like early pressure that forces the opponent into playing awkwardly, which it's not, it implies something a little bit different from aggro, because like it's not, when you say the word tempo, you're often not referring to like pure aggression, but some kind of like leveraged middle ground. All right, that's the Endure list in a nutshell. Ashe Sejuani, this one's hitting tier 1 in a huge way at 60% win rate. Overall, it's a very powerful list. It's able to do very well in the meta right now because Splashing and Culling Strike and Reckoning are great against a bunch of the high value, low attack units that we're seeing in the meta. And, it's just playing like a prototypical mid-range deck in every way, shape, and form. I see a lot of people look at Frostbite and like their instinct is that Frostbite is a control concept. But in every way, Frostbite embodies what it means to be mid-range, which is just like kind of like unit-to-unit combat as like a combat trick, right? It's not good when you don't have units on the board. And that's because you want to be taking the block so that you can deal damage instead of just basically using it as a heal, in which case they would be overpriced. And that sends you into the direction of just playing like raw beef, right? Ashe decks and by extension Sejuani decks, arguably for different reasons, want to be in playing a lot of like just high value cards like Avaros and Trapper and Avaros and Hearthguards, just making sure you own the board so that your Frostbites will be able to, guarantee good exchanges. It should go without saying that you're pretty much not going to be leveling your Sejuani in this deck. We don't have ways of really doing that. I'm sure there will be some like weird edge cases where that'll happen on like a crazy late turn, but for the most part, we are just using her as freeze plus frostbite plus vulnerable plus overwhelm. That's kind of like, wait, I said freeze and frostbite. It's really late here. But anyway, that's Ashe Sejuani. Now, I personally predict that this deck will drop from tier 1 in the way that I was kind of feeling deep as a deck would drop from tier 1. Ultimately, part of these decks' weaknesses is that they aren't as flexible, and that's really important quality for a deck to have. Just like not necessarily like major flexibility, but just being able to, gradually shift, how you want to play the concept is super important, because otherwise you might get stuck against a meta that's responding to you without a response, right? This is a deck that I think has all the markings of a deck that gets value off of surprise value. It comes in at a high win rate, but again, it's hitting good surprise value with some tricks. Like a lot of versions were running like 2 Reckonings, and that can like absolutely win games against opponents that don't know it's there and aren't playing around it. A lot of decks just aren't really equipped to handle the kind of like surge of mid-range right now. I think there's a good chance this deck's win rate is going to be dropping. Well, actually, I can guarantee you the deck's win rate will drop in the next week. The only question is, will it drop by 1%, 5%, how much, right? And that's a really good question, right? I personally think there's a good chance we'll actually be seeing Ashe Sejuani midrange stabilize at tier 2, even though it has a 60% win rate this week. But for the time being, I'm loving seeing, like the stats showing high like diversity of win rate. So I'll happily recommend the deck, and this is not what you were supposed to see. Don't look at that. Okay, anyway. Then next up, we've got Burn Aggro. Burn Aggro is a deck that has a 58% win rate on Ranked Ladder right now. Slightly less play rate. As you can see, last updated 6 days ago. I think this is the first deck so far that we haven't updated since last week's report. It's also funny. The last like 3 weeks, every last week was always 6 days ago. Don't worry about that. But anyway, Burn Aggro with Teemo slotted in is doing very well on all sections of ladder. This is a deck that needs no introduction. We all know Burn Aggro. We all love Burn Aggro. Yeah, overall, this is kind of like the big question is this fight for dominion over like the idea of non-interactive aggression, right? Which is basically, whether you run it with elusives or whether you run it with burn in this case, or maybe something like the Shadow Isles tempo that switches into like the over-the-top condition with burn or they who endure. There's many different ways of running aggro, and the biggest question on everyone's mind is right now, what's going to be the king, right? They're all vying for that spot. Well, it's a really good question. If I had to put money on it, man, it's a tough one. I would actually say Kinkou Elusives probably has the highest long-term chance, and that's simply because well, two or three things. I think the biggest thing is, like, you know, they've got Will of Ionia, and there's a big gap in the market for that right now. Like, it's able to, you know, allow them to beat a lot of other strategies that these ones might have trouble with. They can go like a little bit later when need be, but on top of that, they also, you know, don't allow for any amount of blockers at all, whereas something like the Shadow Isles aggro or tempo style deck does definitely, like, as flexible as it is, it's also very counterable by the meta responding in a specific way. That would be stuff like, you know, just playing more early blockers, right? You don't have the luxury of being able to play more early blockers against Kinkou Elusives. Kinkou Elusives has been the most historically long-term sticking dominant strategy. I know, like, if you've been playing this game for the past week, you might say the Shadow Isles version is really strong, and if you were playing the game for like 2 weeks before the update, or even right now, you might say Burn Aggro is really strong, and they're good decks, but people forget that before that, Kinkou Elusives dominated for over 2 months this deck, and the biggest reason for that is just because you can't really counter this deck as easily, right? Elusive blockers aren't that big of a deal to this deck. They go wide enough that they don't really care. That's huge. Whereas even against like Burn Aggro, just running like something like a Hapless Aristocrat or a Vile Feast does give you like pretty bumped odds against this. Alright, that's Kinkou Elusives. Very straightforward deck, very powerful at the same time. Wait, we were talking about Burn Aggro. Wow, I really got derailed. Anyway, that's Burn Aggro. A really powerful deck that's just really straightforward, and yeah, I mean, I'd recommend it easily to everybody. Alright, next, okay, actual next deck. Lastly, the final deck we were talking about, which is, you know, I called it Killed to Death. I don't know, I couldn't really think of a clever name for this. This is a stupid name. Don't ignore it. It doesn't matter. But basically, the idea is sort of almost a confluence of both other decks. We have kind of like the early tempo combo of Shadow Isles with kind of like the over-the-top burn of Noxus. And we have some crossover too, you know, Transfusion can work with Cursed Keeper, Imperial Demolish can work with Cursed Keeper, you've got Fervor that has, you know, the ability to work with cards like Cursed Keeper, but it's also kind of nice to have stuff like Aristocrat that can, you know, pop things, and some of the Noxus cards can also trigger self-deaths, which can help your Callista level up and potentially win you the game. So basically, it's a very powerful aggro deck. Now, this one is, again, a bit less flexible and definitely a bit less consistent, but overall, it's a solid list. I think this one, similar to the Ashe Sejuani deck, those two are the decks that I would most guess might be donked down to tier 2 next week. It really just comes down to how the meta shapes up, but there's a good chance that the Endure deck will just be able to kind of like flex out in ways that this deck can't, and sort of end up replacing it in whatever speed it decides to play for. But yeah, I mean, we've kind of already explained like a lot of the combos here. I would say one thing about this deck that's important to master is the mulligan. You really want to be like keeping Crimson Disciple and Cursed Keeper, but mulliganing away their committal combo pieces if you don't have the ones they hit. Like, don't keep Transfusion unless you have Disciple, don't keep Caretaker unless you have Keeper, don't keep Butcher unless you have Keeper, don't keep Demolitionist unless you have Disciple, basically. And if you do that, the list plays out just fine. Oh yeah, and also this deck is too new to have a win rate stat. The win rate I have with the deck is, I didn't track every single game. It was a bit over 60%, but that's it's stupid. It's like a sample size of 20. Like, I shouldn't even... It's just misleading to even think about numbers with that low sample size. Anyway, let's go ahead and get into tier 2 territory now. We have Bannerman. Bannerman is a deck that, you know, doesn't see a lot of play on ladder, but it's still a solid deck. This is another one that has not undergone changes. It is just kind of like the, you know, good old true to form Bannerman. And of course, as the meta shifts, it will replace like 1 or 2 cards. Like, some metas might want you to go like a little bit faster with 2 Cythrias. Some might want you to slow it down a bit more with like a second Unyielding Spirit. You know, that's Bannerman. They do have that tiny bit of wiggle room, and they will capitalize on it, right? Like, you will see those shifts pretty commonly, but it also ends up not being that big of a deal. Overall, Bannerman comes in this week at a pretty healthy 55% win rate. And hey, that's pretty solid. It's a deck that still comes in with a good win rate. Not a lot of people are talking about it. Not a lot of people are complaining about it, you know, because the cool thing to do for the past 3 months has been to complain about Bannerman. But I think it's a pretty solid deck. I don't think that in the current environment it has tier 1 potential. I think there is a good amount that's holding it down. A really good example would be something like the Sejuani deck, with which Bannerman has a really hard time against. Refer to the Bilgewater Sejuani deck. They can't close out the game fast enough, and Sejuani has like the kind of like better late game condition. As powerful as Cytheria is against their defensive tools, usually you can't close out the game by the time that Sejuani is going to be leveled, and that's just too big of a threat for this deck to handle, but it's not that far off. Overall, super straightforward. You play your units on curve, you buff big dudes. This deck is... it's just never really going to go out of fashion, you know? It's always just going to be a solid deck. But it has gotten donked down from tier 1, so hey, that's something. Then we got Misfortune Aggro. Now you'll notice this new icon, and that's because it's, even though... ooh, oh, you can highlight slanted text. Oh, that's so cool. Look at that. And sorry. Anyway, Misfortune. It's a little bit different from older versions. This is not like Misfortune Scouts. This is like actual aggro, right? And this has been kind of like growing in popularity in ladder in the last week with a pretty healthy win rate as well, which I'm going to make a cut in the recording now so I can double check. You'll know, if you pay attention to these videos, you can notice me doing that. I'll say, oh, and here's the, and then the win rate, and then cut, and then I'll say the win rate because I've just looked it up in those 2 seconds. Anyway, the win rate stats for this deck could be literally anywhere between like 56 and 60%, depending on how you interpret them. They're in the high 50s, which is, hey, that's pretty good. This is a deck that actually does have the ability to kind of like out-tempo among the best of them. We're seeing, you know, the Greatthorn Companion, now that it got buffed to 5 attack, people are actually slotting this in as like a high quantity in an aggressive deck. Sometimes like, you know, buffing it into a Pursuit or just using straight up like Pursuit. And that's an actual game ender. That's pretty great. Overall, basically getting out of Quinn just allows the archetype to play faster. I've personally been happy about this because I've never liked Quinn in this archetype, but you guys probably know that if you've heard me talk about Quinn. I don't think that's a good card. I think it's definitely... it's better than I thought it was. That's very true, and I'm willing to admit that. It's not out of stubbornness or like unwilling to admit I was wrong. I was wrong. It is better than I thought it was, but I still don't think it's good, you know, and yeah, overall it's fine. It's kind of like an optional slot in, I guess, but I do much prefer the aggro kind of like super fast approach here, and you're often going to be closing out games with rallies. The fact that second Lucian turns into a Relentless Pursuit in your hand is extremely powerful for this kind of deck. I would say, like, really important when you're just evaluating decks. Don't fall into the trap of just looking at, like, you know, a bunch of individual cards or colors. When you look at this deck, it probably looks pretty close to Bannerman, right? These are incredibly different decks. When you glance at them, they have a lot of the same cards, and they're like running the same colors, except for this one has like a weird splash. But Bannerman is absolutely a mid-range deck, and this is absolutely an aggro deck, and that kind of makes all the difference. Like, this deck wants to play slowly. It uses these tools to play more slowly. Versions that have like a couple of splash Cytherias, which is, you know, again, something that goes in and out of fashion, they often are using them for kind of just owning the board and for defense, or like buffing with Bannerman if anything else, whereas this deck just wants to end the game early and just make sure you can't do anything about it, right? So overall, the cards that have changed make a really big difference, and they're gonna have completely different like matchup tables because of that. Just a short aside, because I think I see a lot of people that kind of judge a deck by its cards. A deck is ultimately more than the sum of its parts. Okay, then we've got Lux Heimer coming in at a 57% win rate. This is pretty powerful. This is going to be kind of like latest versions. I know a lot of people have been messing around with this concept. I saw BBG was taking a stab at this. This is my particular version of Lux Heimer, which I think ended up fairly similar to other versions kind of being experimented with. Overall, you know, getting into like the kind of like more Mage Seeker style package. Basically, the deck is straightforward, right? This is a deck that plays pretty slowly, but also for kind of like mid-range capabilities, right? They just shove a bunch of beef onto the board, and they do so in a way that can be slow. They're often looking to skip the first 2 turns so that they can play Remembrance on turn 3, and then just from then on just play big dude Insider, and then like big dude, you know, whatever. Could be like Mage Seeker plus X, could be Radiant, could be second Remembrance. They just want to play a lot of big dudes, right? Heimer, often you're playing on 5, but if you don't have a way to protect him, it's really, really important to not just throw him out. I see that that's such a common mistake among like new players when they play Heimerdinger decks. You really have to consider the opponent's matchup. If they have a way to kill him, sometimes you have to pass to let your opponent tap their mana so that they're too low to use what they could have had as an answer, so then you can play your Heimer, and then next turn you'll have the Twin Disciplines or the Prismatic Barrier or whatever to keep him alive. You'll have the mana for that. That's such a common sort of thing that you're going to be needing to think about as a Heimer player. And if you do that, Heimer is very powerful. It's a super strong card, super strong archetype. Right now, Heimer is sort of carrying P and Z, actually. But yeah, this list combines kind of everything you know and love about, you know, Heimer and the spell package with everything you know and love about kind of like Lux and her, you know, Demacia spell package. Heimer Lux has been a deck. I mentioned this in the last week's video. I've liked Lux Heimer for ages. It's always felt like it was so close and like just needed one tiny push to feel like a solid deck. And right now with the other nerfs coming in and with the state of the meta, yeah, it definitely feels like it got there. Like this is definitely a solid deck that's worth checking out. Next up, we've got Deep coming in at a 54% win rate. Yeah, I think this is definitely a tier 2 deck. I don't know. There were a lot of people that were kind of like on the, oh, Deep is tier 1 train. I think this was a meme this entire time. I don't think this deck had any showings of, it never had a tier 1 win rate. It doesn't have any of the qualities that a tier 1 deck needs, just from an archetypal standpoint. That being said, I did end up putting it in the bottom of tier 1 last week just because there were enough other people that were saying this has to be tier 1 that I was like, wow, I'm probably wrong then. It probably is tier 1. And that's not me doing like a fucking I told you so. That's just like, because I mean I still was wrong because I still did end up like putting it in there. But yeah, overall Deep is, I don't think, going to be a super solid deck moving. I mean, okay, I shouldn't phrase it like that. It's a good 54%. It's a fine win rate. It's tier 2 competitive. It's solid, right? But it just in terms of kind of like the impression a lot of people were giving that it's like, oh, Deep is nuts, oh, this is the new meta, that is definitely a little far-fetched. But yeah, like with all Deep decks, you're just going to, you know, play slowly, try to stall it out. Right now, we're in a meta where you are going to want to just slow the game down quite a bit more. Last week, the Deep deck we were playing was one that had a lot more kind of anti-mirror tech, and that was just because there were, for the first few days of the patch, there was a lot of Deep going on in the ladder. Honestly, this deck actually, you know, usually I try to keep the site very up to date. This deck in particular has probably been out of date, non-updated for like 4 days now, because it was kind of heavy teched for the Deep mirror. It was doing some like greedy things, and the fad that was Deep ended up like dropping in play rate fairly quickly. Don't get me wrong, it's still a deck you'll steal on ladder, but it was teched in for a meta where it's like everyone and their mom was playing Deep. Now we've kind of taken out like we've taken out more of the super like greedy anti-mirror tools and just put in more of the kind of like sustain and get to late game package. Overall, still the archetype, you know, that we expect. It's just going to be stalling, getting to Deep, and then smashing with a couple of big dudes. All right, then in tier 2 we have Vladimir Sejuani, an archetype that comes in at a 55% win rate. Overall, it's very interestingly positioned in the meta right now. I mean, again, right now this is a mid-range meta that is very much just like, oh, my dad can beat up your dad. Right now, like what you're looking for from a deck is just the ability to kind of like go toe-to-toe with other mid-range decks and just kind of out-beef them. This is why cards like Sejuani are so good, because it's sort of like the mid-range mirror card. This is why Heimer Vi is good as well, because I would personally call Heimer Vi a mid-range deck. Again, that's another one it does have some of the properties of a control deck, but you're not really playing spells for the late game. You're just like playing them to own and develop the board, right? And play for like value trades and everything that's involved in that. And yeah, this is kind of like the nature of kind of like, I would say, most of the powerful things in the meta right now. So there's a huge, I would say, there's a huge niche in the market for mid-range decks that can beat other mid-range decks. And this deck is very good at doing that. Sejuani, we've seen 3 different decks so far that have Sejuani in her, and she is the epitome of mid-range that beats mid-range mirrors, right? She's, you know, going to come in at the right time. There's not going to be enough pressure for her to be too late, and she will have the ability to flip. If she flips, it's game over, because like mid-range mirrors can't do anything against her level up condition that will just win the game. But hey, Vlad and the Crimson game plan is also really good in that sort of mid-range mirror condition too. Trifarian gives you kind of like infinite out value. And then, of course, you have the same tools and stuff like Curator, Combat Trick in the form of Transfusion. So overall, it's just a good deck at slapping other mid-range archetypes. And you've even got healing now with Transfusion, now that, you know, he's got the little bit of the drain effect. I think this deck is just kind of getting carried by Sejuani. Okay, I'm going to be completely honest. I only put this deck up here because a lot of you guys were like, Swim, what tier is the Vlad deck? I was getting spammed in both my YouTube comments and in Twitch chat. People were like, Swim, you released the Meta Mondays, and I think you made a mistake with it. I think you forgot to put a Vlad deck in there, Swim. What about the Vlad deck? And I caved. I had to do it. I put the Vlad deck in here. It's not bad. It's not bad. Oh, and by the way, the reason, by the way, there's that sort of like dilemma for me, incidentally, isn't because it's a bad deck per se. It is tier 2, you know, I've put it here, but basically I would say it sort of ends up being a worse version of other Sejuani decks. It's getting carried by the same thing that's carrying those decks, but it sort of just uses a lot of like somewhat awkward cards to get there, right? And that's kind of the biggest thing to realize about stuff like a tier list, which is that when things get excluded from the tier list, it's not necessarily because they're below tier 3 or below Keck W tier. It's more often just because they are worse versions of things that are already on the list, right? Okay. So, moving along then, we've got the last tier 2 entry, Lux Karma. Lux Karma has seen kind of like a bit of a mixed reception. It's coming in at a 54% win rate this week. It's not bad. You know, it still kind of meets what I would consider to be like the sort of like tier 2 cutoff in general. It is a solid deck. The biggest problem with Lux Karma, though, is, again, sort of like the fact that I think you might rather be in like the Heimerdinger versions right now, or something else with Ionia. Ionia ends up feeling like kind of surprisingly bad off of this change. Like, you know, I mean, Karma getting nerfed by 1 point, it's not a huge deal. It is and always was like a slightly bigger like there were some people that were saying like, oh, Karma plus 1 mana, that's never gonna make a difference, you know, whatever. And it definitely does, but even given that, I'm surprised at the state of Ionia right now. And that gets embodied entirely by the next entry on this list, which is Karma Ezreal. I'm not, as with always on the Meta Mondays, I'm not going to go through each individual tier 3 deck, because it would take too long at that point, especially with how many decks we have now. But if you guys want to look at updated versions of these decks, they are on the site, okay? So Karma Ezreal, I will go through. I'm gonna look at this and I'm gonna talk about this. Karma Ezreal. The story of Karma Ezreal. Okay, gather round. It started a few months ago. You know, it was snowballing in popularity, and mostly other forms of Ezreal got nerfed, and bam, as soon as that happened, Karma Ezreal was the best Ezreal deck. In a meta where Ezreal was dominant for 3+ weeks? No, about 2.5 months at that point. And it was really good. It was tier 1 for like over a month. Everyone was saying it was like the best deck in the game. And it might have been. Maybe it probably was. It was a really good deck. It was a tier 1 deck. And then the Bilgewater expansion hit, and it got some sweet new tools. It got some crazy new tools. It got deep meditation. It got Eye of the Dragon. You know, you can run some like champion flexibles. Like you can run it with like Ezreal Vi instead of the Karma, right? And it still ends up being kind of the same deck, even though you're not running Karma anymore. It's just like, and then as soon as that happened, it didn't feel like a tier 1 deck after the patch. It didn't have tier 1 stats. Nobody who was playing it was feeling it was tier 1. And now, you know, stuff like all the tier 1 decks got hit hard. Deep Meditation got nerfed, which does hurt the deck a bit, but every single variant of Karma Ezreal is just getting absolutely ass blasted on every ladder. This is all ranks. So here's Karma Ezreal, 48, 46, 48, 43, every version. And then here's Masters, 49, 44. And there's 2 down here that are positive, but you'll notice that their sample sizes are incredibly low. The 46 and 40. So it's like, you know, when you go down like this low, there's always going to be some that are very very positive that, you know, isn't going to be an indication of too much. Overall, this is a really bizarre deck. I will say, in the same way that I expect something like Ashe Sejuani or maybe the Noxus SI deck to go to tier 2 next week, I expect the same for Karma Ezreal. I think that it's a flexible deck. People do need to figure out the best way to build it for the new meta, and the meta sort of needs to figure itself out a bit for Karma Ezreal to even get to that point, right? Because it is a very reactive deck, so it sort of does come in a later wave in the meta. But god damn, does it have a low win rate right now. Like, this is unheard of. These kinds of sample sizes, these kinds of persistent win rates across every single variation is ridiculous. Like, and I have many theories about what's making Karma Ezreal weaker than before. There's many factors you can attribute it to, but when you look at that disparity, when you look at it being, there were many people going into the Bilgewater expansion that were expecting it to be the best deck in the game, bar none, like tier 0. I was basically one of them. I was on the fence. Like, I wouldn't say tier 0, but I thought it would be very good. And then not only was it underwhelming, but after the nerf, suddenly it has a sub 50 on everything. And, you know, there's many individual factors you can be like, well, Swim, yeah, you know, the one card got nerfed, or you can be like, well, Swim, yeah, you know, the meta shifted in a way that Will of Ionia is slightly less impactful. But to account for that level of disparity is so insane. It's just like this, it's just crazy, man. I can't explain it being that low. 40s, every 45 to 49% across the board is something I can't explain. So I do think when the deck figures itself out, it'll be back to tier 2 at least, but at the very least, I don't think that deck is hitting tier 1 again anytime in the foreseeable future. Stocks are low on Karma Ezreal. I would recommend sell now. Alright guys, anyway, that's it. That's kind of like the meta update in a nutshell. As I mentioned before, if you want to check out the tier 3 decks, they're going to be on the site. And yeah, I mean, that's about all I have for this week. I'm going to go to bed because it's really late for me. Alright. Yeah, good night, guys.